The first spark. The year was 2461, and the stars looked close enough to touch, yet still too far for the people of Earth, who had spent centuries watching the sky from below and dreaming of belonging among the great empires of the galaxy. Humanity had finally built ships that could cross the distances, but power did not bring peace. The Kestros Empire, a cold and perfect rule of machines and masters, kept watch over every new world and taxed every breath that dared to dream without permission. Earth had learned to survive quietly, paying what it must and hiding what it could. Yet beneath the gray surface of the lunar shipyard, something new waited to rise. It was called Dawnstar. Not a battleship, not yet a legend, but a strange blend of freighter, bones, and secret armor plates forged in hidden forges under the Sea of Tranquility. Its design had been whispered between engineers who remembered the old wars and believed that humans were meant to fight their own battles again. At the center of it all stood Captain Mara Vale, tall, steady eyes the color of a storm over iron seas. She had spent her youth hauling ore between the colonies and watching Kestros patrols drift through her scanners like vultures over a sleeping field. She never looked away when they passed. She only counted their weapons and remembered their names. When the day of inspection came, a Kestros tax ship descended like a silver claw. The alien commander demanded tribute in the name of order and progress. Dock. Workers bowed heads, afraid of the punishment for defiance. Mara stepped forward, her uniform still marked with the grease of engines, and said that Earth had paid enough. Her voice carried across the hangar, cold and clear, and every human there felt something they had forgotten stir behind their ribs. The Kestros called her insolent and struck her with the back of a metal hand, but she did not kneel. The sound of that strike echoed louder than any alarm, and in that moment, something in the air changed. That night, as the Empire's envoys departed, a shadow moved across the lunar horizon. A blast tore through the lower yard, flames rolling in silence across the vacuum while alarms screamed through sealed helmets. It was sabotage, a warning, a reminder that rebellion would be met with death. Mara ran through the smoke and gravity shifts, pulling survivors into escape corridors and sealing ruptured bulkheads with her own hands. The air burned her lungs, the steel cut her palms. But she did not stop, because behind her in the central dock, Dawnstar still waited, untested, unfinished, yet alive. The crew gathered what they could: engineers, pilots, medics, miners, anyone who would not bow. Ortega, the chief engineer, rerouted half the yards. Power to the ship. Jin, the pilot, mapped emergency coordinates through the debris field that hung beyond orbit. When the Kestros patrol returned expecting wreckage, they found the yard empty, and a single ship rising through the dust like a shard of light. Dawnstar's hull glowed red from the heat of ignition, but held steady. No anthem played, no flags flew, only the hum of engines built by tired hands that refused to die quietly. As Earth rotated below them, Mara stood on the bridge looking down at the blue planet. Her voice came through the comm channels, calm but fierce. "We are leaving home to protect it," she said. "We are hunted, but we are not prey. If they call us rebels, let them. We will show them what humans can become when cornered." Ortega laughed, a cracked, tired sound, and called her mad. Jin smiled and said madness was the only engine that had ever driven humanity forward. The ship jumped for the first time, tearing through the thin skin of space into the cold between stars. Behind them, the moon still burned in places, but its fires were the first lights of something new. Across the scattered colonies, whispers began. A human warship had escaped the Empire. A captain had defied the Kestros. The rumor carried faster than truth, as it always did, and every miner, every student, every forgotten worker looked up and felt a pulse of pride that had been asleep for generations. Far from home, Mara watched the navigation screens, steadying her breath. The systems flickered, but held. She touched the bulkhead beside her, whispering as if to an old friend, "We are not running. We are finding the fight." Dawnstar hummed back as if it understood. In that endless black sea where empires thought humanity was too small to matter, a single human ship moved forward, blazing a thin line of defiance across the dark. It was not much, but it was enough to start a legend, raising the banner. The Dawnstar moved through the dark between stars like a scar that refused to close each jump. stretched her hull and made the crew breathe slow and steady for fear that one mistake could scatter them across the void. Yet no one complained because for the first time in generations they were free, and freedom, even when painful, tasted better than fear. Captain Mara Vale spent long hours on the bridge with her hands resting on the old steel rails, watching the faint blue glow of the engines ripple across the glass, her eyes always fixed on the map of stars before her. She thought of Earth, the smoke over the lunar yards, the silence that followed, and she wondered if anyone left behind still believed in what they had started, or if they were already forgotten. But then she would look around at her crewmen and women, drawn from 100 scattered corners of humanity, and she would remember that belief was not built on comfort. It was built on fire. Engineer Ortega's apprentice now carried the old man's tools and refused to let the ship fall silent. He rerouted damaged circuits with cable made from mining belts and coaxed the reactor to sing again. He said the Dawnstar was alive and needed care, not fear, and the crew listened to him because he spoke to the ship as if it were human. Jin, the pilot, still laughed in the middle of danger, his hands light on the controls, his voice a steady rhythm that filled the cockpit when everything else trembled around them. He had mapped every small gravity, every hidden shadow in the system, and he swore that no Kestros ship would ever catch them because the stars themselves would hide the Dawnstar. Their first mission was not for glory, it was for survival. They heard the cries of miners trapped on Europa, a colony stripped bare by Kestros, tribute ships who had taken their fuel and left them to freeze. Mara knew saving them would mean breaking every imperial law, but she could not ignore them. So the Dawnstar descended through the cold storms of Jupiter's moon, flying low under magnetic cover, and landed on the shattered ice. The miners looked up in disbelief when they saw a human warship bearing no imperial mark and a woman in a patched uniform walking through the snow carrying food and medicine, not orders or whips. When the Kestros patrol returned to claim the last of their tribute, they found the miners armed with mining lasers and the Dawnstar's shadow rising above the horizon. The battle was quick and rough. Plasma bolts burned through thin ice geysers erupted as if the moon itself roared, and for a moment the crew of the Dawnstar saw themselves reflected in the enemy's eyes, not as servants, not as victims, but as equals fighting for the right to stand. When the patrol was gone, Mara sent a single message into the void, a short transmission that reached every human outpost within 3 jumps. "We will not bow," she said, her voice calm and steady. "We are small, but we are not broken. Earth remembers, and so will the stars." That message traveled far faster than their ship carried by traders, smugglers, and whispers, and soon other colonies began to stir. Small ships began to vanish from Kestros routes, not destroyed, but missing in the right direction. Food convoys appeared where none should have been. Weapons stolen from imperial stores found their way into the hands of miners and farmers. The Empire called it chaos, but the humans called it awakening. On a forgotten moon of Saturn, the crew found an old data buoy still functioning from before the Empire's arrival. Inside were recordings of Earth's early explorers' voices speaking of courage and wonder, and they played those voices over the Dawnstar's comm as they worked, reminding themselves what it meant to be human. Each night, Mara stood before the viewport and spoke softly to the memory of Ortega, and all who had fallen in the first fight. She promised that every breath they took would build toward something greater, that humanity would no longer crawl beneath another's rule. Elin, the Vairi cartographer who had joined them after seeing their broadcast, began to chart paths that no empire dared to travel, tunnels of gravity and dust where only desperate or free souls would go. The crew followed, without hesitation, because they had nothing left to lose. But Chains, the Kestros High Command, began to whisper the name Dawnstar with unease. They sent hunters, fast, sleek ships to intercept, but they found nothing, only wrecked drones and empty trails. For every blow the Empire struck, 2 new sparks rose, somewhere else. And though the Dawnstar was just one ship, it carried an idea that no empire could kill. Among the stars, people began to paint the symbol of a rising sun on their hulls, a circle of light cut by a single line, the mark of humanity. Reborn Mara watched the growing signs of rebellion spreading beyond her reach, and she knew this was only the beginning. The fight would be long and bloody, but the first banner had been raised not of conquest, but of defiance and hope. And it would fly as long as even one human heart beat against the silence of space. Friends in the dark. The Dawnstar drifted beyond the edge of mapped space, its engines whispering through the black, while every sensor swept for signs of pursuit. Yet the Kestro's fleet seemed far behind their heavy ships, too slow to follow through the thin lanes that wound between dying suns. Captain Mara Vale stood at the center of the bridge, her gaze fixed on a faint light ahead, a signal pulsing in an old pattern long forgotten by the Empire. Elin the Vairi cartographer sat beside her, his four slender arms tracing invisible lines in the air as he calculated coordinates through dust storms of charged ions. He was a quiet being, eyes like dim moons and skin that shimmered with colors that had no name. He had been watching the humans for weeks before revealing himself, sending encrypted signals that only a ship with human chaos in its circuits could decode. When he finally appeared on the main screen, Mara had almost opened fire, thinking it was another Kestro's trick, but instead of commands or threats he had offered a trade maps for trust. Elin told them of ancient routes older than the Empire, lanes carved by forgotten species before Kestro's control. He had hidden these paths for centuries, waiting for a people reckless enough to use them because those lanes were dangerous. They ran close to collapsing stars and black storms that ate signals whole, but they were invisible to the Empire's network. Mara accepted the offer, knowing that every new path was another chance for survival. The crew followed Island's trail into the gray sectors where even light seemed to hesitate, and for the first time, they were truly free from the Empire's eyes. It was there they found the refinery at Hadron's Belt, a floating labyrinth of pipes and flames built around a gas giant stripped to its bones. Thousands of workers toiled under Kestro's command collars around their necks that burned. If they slowed their pace, the refinery produced fuel for the war fleets, and its destruction would shake the Empire's reach across 5 systems. But Mara did not go there to destroy. She went there to free. The Dawnstar hid behind the thick rings of the planet, its hull coated in dust to mask its signature, while Jin guided them through debris fields with hands that barely trembled. Ortega's apprentice rerouted all energy to the engines for one long silent run, straight through the patrol net. When the Dawnstar broke through the final barrier and appeared above the refinery, the alarms began to wail across every platform. Kestro's sentries fired without warning, but the humans moved faster, their drones darting through the smoke like silver insects, cutting the slave collars one by one. The workers looked up confused, at first afraid to hope, until Mara's voice came through the loudspeakers telling them to run to the evacuation decks where the Dawnstar would take them home. For the first time in years, they heard a human voice that spoke not of orders, but of freedom, and the sound spread like fire through the tunnels. The fight raged for hours until the main core overloaded and the refinery erupted in a storm of light visible across the entire sector. The Dawnstar barely escaped the blast, dragging half-crippled shuttles full of survivors in its wake. When the dust cleared, Elin spoke softly to Mara, saying that no one had ever dared to strike the Empire in its heart and live to tell the tale. Yet she had done it not for conquest, but for the nameless souls who labored in chains. The Vairi, who had always hidden behind trade routes, began to whisper that perhaps humanity was not mad, but brave, and some even offered secret support, smuggling supplies through forgotten gates. Mara did not celebrate. She sat in silence, staring at the empty seat where Ortega would have been, and whispered that they would keep fighting, because someone had to. Jin recorded the freed workers singing on the decks, and sent the recording across every pirate frequency, so that anyone listening would hear the sound of hope. The Kestro's High Command received the report in cold fury, calling it treason against order, but the damage was done for, in the corners of the galaxy, where light barely reached small species, began to paint the image of a rising sun beside their own symbols. They no longer whispered about humans with pity, but with respect. The Empire could not understand it. They believed strength came from fear, while humanity showed that strength could be born from kindness and courage. The Dawnstar became a myth, a ghost ship that appeared where people suffered and vanished before the Empire could catch it. And Mara Vale became a name carried in secret prayers of slaves and traders alike in the quiet after the battle. Mara stood beside Elin on the observation deck and watched the stars turn slowly. She asked him why he helped them when his own people had hidden for so long. And Island answered that he had lived through 1,000 years of obedience and silence, but when he heard the voice of a human woman telling her people to rise, he remembered what it felt like to be alive. Mara said, "Then that maybe freedom was not something you kept. It was something you gave away until everyone had it," and Elin bowed his head in agreement. Far from any world that had known peace, the Dawnstar sailed on, gathering the lost, the broken and the brave, forging a family from the ruins of an empire, and a hope that would not die. The knife above. The Dawnstar had become more than a ship. It was a whisper that moved faster than the light of its engines, spreading through trade routes and broken colonies, as a promise that the empire could bleed. But in the halls of the Kestro's high command, that same whisper was a thorn that drew blood from pride and fear. The High Lord of the Fleets called a council, his voice cold and measured as he ordered that the human ship be found and erased from all memory, for no empire could allow a spark to burn. So near its throne, dozens of cruisers began to sweep the outer sectors, while spies and bounty hunters filled the lanes with false trails and coded traps, waiting for the humans to take one wrong step. Captain Mara Vale did not know that the storm was already gathering. She only knew that fuel was running low and that her crew was exhausted from weeks of rescue missions and raids that never seemed to end. Elin had warned her that the Kestros were not beaten. They were simply learning, and that a hunter learns best from its prey. Still, Mara pushed forward, guided by the hope that one more strike could open a wider path for others to follow. When a coded transmission arrived from a friendly trader promising information about a hidden Kestro's convoy carrying weapons and maps of the Empire's next expansion, she did not hesitate to answer it, for information meant survival. The meeting point was a lonely station, drifting near a dying red star, its hull cracked and leaking gas like a wounded beast. The Dawnstar approached in silence, sensors scanning for traps but finding only emptiness, so Mara gave the order to dock. The first minutes were calm too. Calm, and even Jin muttered that space. This quiet was never safe. They stepped, inside the station lights, flickering corridors echoing with the sound of distant machinery, until they reached the main chamber, where a single crate waited, marked with the symbol of the Empire crossed out with red paint. Ortega's apprentice moved forward to scan it, and the reading came back clean. No explosives, no signals, just data drives inside. Mara opened her mouth to speak when Elin suddenly screamed in his strange language, and the floor beneath them came alive, a hidden pulse bomb buried in the deck exploded upward, sending a wave of heat and pressure that tore through the chamber. The Dawnstar's docking tube snapped like a twig, bodies were thrown across the walls, alarms screamed through the comms, and in that chaos the truth came clear: the convoy was bait. The entire station a trap set to draw them out. Outside, the void filled with the shapes of Kestro's warships unfolding from stealth fields, engines glowing with cold blue fire. The Dawnstar's shields flared under the first barrage, and half her systems went dark. The crew scrambled to reroute power while Mara dragged the wounded back through the broken airlock. The station burned around them, metal melting air hissing into nothing. Ortega's apprentice stayed behind to hold the failing seal long enough for the rest to cross his face. Calm even as the vacuum took him, and Mara saw in his eyes the same fire that had once lived in Ortega himself. She shouted for the doors to close. And when they did, she felt the weight of another life lost for her cause. The Dawnstar broke free, engines screaming through the void, as Jin threw the ship into a spiral that scraped the edge of a dying sun's gravity well. The heat scorched their hull and blinded their sensors, but it also melted the Empire's tracking fields, buying them a moment of escape. In the silence that followed, no one spoke. The bridge lights dim, and the smell of burnt circuits heavy in the air. Elin's voice finally broke through, saying that this was not just a failed ambush, it was a message the Empire was adapting, learning to use deception the way humans did. Mara stood still, her hands trembling as she stared at the damage report. Half the crew gone, half the systems crippled, and yet somewhere deep inside the ship, a new signal pulsed, a fragment of stolen code that Elin had grabbed from the trap before it closed. The code spoke of something the Kestros had hidden for centuries, a single mind that coordinated all their logistics, a vast artificial intelligence called Spine that lived inside a moving fortress arc, drifting between systems, never stopping, never sleeping, controlling every route, every fleet, every flow of supplies and orders. If the spine were to fall, the Empire would starve from within, its fleets unable to move, its armies cut off from command, and its power fading like a candle in a storm. Mara listened to the words, and for the first time since the rebellion began, she saw not just survival but victory within reach. She knew it would be impossible to attack such a thing with one ship, but she also knew that impossibility had never stopped humans before. The Dawnstar drifted in the shadow of broken stars, bleeding light, into darkness, while its captain looked into the void and whispered to the ghosts of her crew that the next fight would not be for revenge, but for freedom, for every soul that had ever lived under the Empire's chains. The crew gathered behind her, silent but united, and the Dawnstar turned toward the hidden path that would lead them to the heart of the Empire itself. Building the impossible. The Dawnstar drifted for many days among the ghost systems where broken satellites circled dead. Worlds and the light of distant suns could no longer reach. The crew worked in silence, patching hull plates, melting down scraps to rebuild the engines, and using old cargo containers as living quarters, while the wounded healed in makeshift bunks. The air was heavy with the scent of oil and steel and the quiet grief of those who had seen too much loss. But in that silence, Captain Mara Vale felt something begin to rise again, a slow and stubborn determination that would not die. Elin studied the fragment of code taken from the Kestros trap, and with every calculation he grew more certain that the mind called spine was not a myth, but the living core of the Empire itself, a machine intelligence spread across a fortress arc that never stayed in one place for long. If the rebels could reach it, they could end the endless chain of command that made the Kestros untouchable. Mara gathered her crew in the main bay, a space lit only by the faint blue shimmer of the reactor, and she spoke to them with a voice that carried the weight of both sorrow and promise. She told them that they had two choices: to hide and fade away like every defeated people before them, or to build something that could break the Empire, even if it cost them everything. The crew did not cheer, they simply nodded, each one knowing what it meant to stand beside her again. Jin raised his hand and said that if they were to fight a fortress the size of a moon, they would need more than courage, they would need numbers and skill and machines. Mara agreed and said they would build an army, not of soldiers but of survivors. They began with the refugees they had saved from Hadron's Belt, turning miners into engineers, farmers into pilots, and traders into couriers. Every human who could hold a tool or guide a shuttle became part of the plan. The Dawnstar became both school and forge, its corridors, filled with voices teaching and learning and dreaming together. They scavenged wrecks, stripped abandoned stations, and pieced together small strike ships, drones, and decoys, each one wired with the same stubborn ingenuity that had kept humanity alive for centuries. Island mapped hidden lanes through forgotten regions, and soon their single ship became a network. A swarm of light spreading through the dark, carrying hope where fear had lived too long. Messages traveled across the hidden channels, coded in old Earth songs and nursery rhymes, so that no machine could read them and no spy could break them. In those songs the promise was clear: stand 1 hour, stand one more, hold the line until the Dawnstar arrives. It was simple and human, and it spread like wildfire. Even among the Viri and the smaller species who had lived in quiet submission, something began to stir. They sent supplies and scouts and small vessels to join the humans, not because they believed they could win, but because they wanted to believe in something again. Each day brought danger. Kestros patrols closed in on suspected rebel cells, burning worlds that had whispered the name of Mara Vale. But even as fire fell from the skies, the rebellion grew stronger, because every act of cruelty only proved the Empire's fear. The elder from the lunar yards who had once watched the first launch of the Dawnstar now spoke through open comms, his old voice cracked, but strong, saying that freedom was not given by mercy, it was earned by standing when standing seemed impossible. His words reached billions, and the Empire's silence could not stop them. Mara stood beside him one night as he recorded his final broadcast, his eyes shining with tears. He said that he was not afraid to die because he had seen the next generation rise in the ashes, and that was enough. When the message ended, he smiled at her and said that the future always belongs to those who dare to build it. The next day, the Kestros found his station and turned it to dust, but his words lived on in every ship that bore the sign of the rising sun. The plan to reach the fortress arc called for perfect timing. The rebels needed to hit the Empire's supply routes all at once to force the fleets away from the Ark, leaving it exposed for a single window of time. Elin calculated that window to be less than one day, after which the Ark would vanish again behind the veil of the Empire's defenses. Every ship, every drone, every fighter prepared for that single strike. The Dawnstar would lead from the front, its damaged hull shining with fresh armor made from scavenged Kestro's metal, a symbol that even the tools of oppression could be turned into instruments of freedom. When the day came, the stars themselves seemed to tremble under the roar of engines, 1,000 human and allied ships rising from the shadows to strike together, their weapons lighting the dark like a storm of suns. Across the void, the Kestro's fleet scrambled, too slow, too divided to understand what was happening, and for the first time in memory, the Empire felt fear. The Dawnstar dove into the chaos, Mara at the helm, her eyes burning with the fire of all who had fallen, whispering to herself that no empire could stand forever, and that even the coldest machine could be broken if faced with human will. In that moment, humanity was no longer small. It was a force of nature, a storm born of pain and courage, building the impossible with bare hands and burning hearts. The heaviest choice. The Dawnstar hung at the edge of the void, where the last beacon of the human rebellion flickered weakly in the dark, its light little more than a heartbeat against the endless night, and every person aboard felt the weight of what was to come pressing down like gravity too heavy to bear. The maps drawn by Elaine glowed faint blue across the bridge, showing the path to the fortress arc that carried the mind-called spine, a path that cut through the densest storms of radiation and debris, a path that no sane pilot would dare to take. But the window was open and closing fast, and Mara, Vale, knew there would not be another. Around them, the rebellion's fleets scattered across dozens of systems were striking every Kestro's route at once, each attack designed not to win, but to distract. And in that chaos, the Dawnstar would slip through, unseen, to reach the heart of the Empire itself. Yet the plan came with a cost that no one wanted to name aloud, because to draw the Kestro's fleets away from the Ark, they would need to bait them toward Earth and Dawnfall, the birthplace of the rebellion, the home of the first ship, the cradle of their people. The Empire would see the movements and strike at the source, bringing fire and ruin, and there would be no time to save both the planet and the mission. Elin tried to calculate another path, but his equations always ended the same. There was no victory without sacrifice. Mara stood silent for a long time, her hands tight on the railing, eyes on the spinning maps, as the crew watched her, waiting for the order that would decide the fate of everything they had built. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. She said that Earth had given them life, and now it would give them time. She said that the Dawnstar would continue toward the Ark, and that Dawnfall would stand as the shield that held the Empire back until the strike was done. No one cheered. The words fell like stones into still water, and for a moment the silence felt endless, until Jin spoke from the helm, saying that the people of Earth would understand, because they had always stood their ground even when no one came to save them. Island bowed his head and said that humans carried a strength that frightened even gods, for they could choose to lose everything and still call it victory. The message was sent to the Defense Council of Earth, and within hours a reply came, a simple broadcast that played across every rebel frequency, 1,000 voices speaking together through static, saying, "We will hold for the time you need." There was no anger, no blame, only a fierce calm that spread through every ship in the fleet and every soul who heard it. On the bridge of the Dawnstar, tears ran down faces that had forgotten how to cry, and Mara closed her eyes, whispering a promise that their sacrifice would not be wasted. The next day, the Kestro's fleets appeared above Earth, black wings blotting out the sun, their weapons raining down fire, while the defenders rose from every orbit station, every bunker, and every shipyard. To meet them, the skies filled with debris and smoke, and yet the message never stopped. "We will hold for the time you need." It echoed across the system and reached the Dawnstar like a heartbeat, guiding them forward as they began the long burn toward the fortress arc. Jin pushed. The engines passed safety. The hull shuddered as it tore through plasma storms and radiation fields, while Elin read the shifting data streams guiding them through the narrowest gaps between death and darkness. Behind them, Earth burned, but it also fought holding the Empire's attention as planned, and in that sacrifice lay the hope of all free worlds. On board the Dawnstar, the crew worked in silence, every move precise, every breath heavy with memory and fear, but none turned back. They crossed the final gate and emerged into a region where space itself seemed alive with motion. The fortress arc drifting ahead like a continent of steel, its surface lit by rivers of energy that pulsed with the rhythm of a beating heart. This was the spine, the center of the Empire, the mind that bound every fleet, every soldier, every world in obedience. Mara stood before the viewport, her reflection ghostly against the glowing machine world, and she felt the presence of every human who had died to bring them here, whispering through the hum of the engines. She thought of the miners freed from chains, of the elder whose voice had carried across the stars, of the friends buried in silence, and of Earth holding the line against an empire that believed it could not fall. The choice had been made, and its weight would never leave her. But she carried it with pride, because it was the choice of a species that refused to kneel. She turned to her crew and said that this was the moment they had built for. Every strike, every loss, every breath had led here, and now they would finish it. The crew rose from their stations one by one and answered with the same word together. The Dawnstar set its course for the heart of the arc engines, flaring brighter than the stars around them, and for the first time in history, a human ship flew straight into the core of the Empire, not as prey, but as the storm that would change everything. The human finish, the fortress arc, loomed before the Dawnstar, a colossal world of moving steel, wrapped in storms of energy, its surface alive with the glow of millions of circuits and ships that orbited it like a swarm of hornets guarding their queen. It was not built, it was grown, layer by layer across centuries, until it became the size of a small moon, and within its heart pulsed the mind called Spine, the machine that whispered orders to every Kestro's fleet and every world under their rule. For all the battles humanity had fought, for all the losses they had endured, this was the place where it would end, or everything would be for nothing. Captain Mara Vale stood at the bridge, her hands steady though her heart pounded like a drum, her crew around her silent, waiting for her word. Elan fed the coordinates into the navigation system while Jin adjusted the thrusters, aligning the ship for a dive through the outer defense grid. Their shields flickered with strain, but no one slowed down, because they all knew that once they began, there would be no turning back. The first line of defense came alive as they approached, beams of blue energy cutting across space like knives. The Dawnstar twisted through them like a dancer, her engines screaming against the pressure, every move timed to a heartbeat as missiles and drones exploded in their wake. The ship's hull rattled under impacts but still held strong, because it had been built by hands that refused to give up. When they breached the outer shell, Mara gave the order to deploy the decoy drones, hundreds of small metal ghosts that spread through the void, sending false signals to confuse the fortress sensors, and for a moment the Dawnstar disappeared from the Empire's sight. Elan guided them toward the access gate hidden beneath a mountain of metal where the energy conduits met in a single pulse line. It was the place where the mind of the Spine touched the physical world, a place few had ever seen and fewer had survived. They landed hard, the ship's belly scraping against scorched steel, the heat so intense that the air shimmered inside the corridors. Mara led the strike team, herself armed, not with heavy weapons, but with a portable core link that could reach the fortress network once they were inside. The corridors of the arc stretched endlessly, cold and perfect, lit by veins of white light that pulsed with the rhythm of a living heart. As they moved deeper, the hum grew louder, like a song of machines whispering to themselves. In languages older than any human tongue, they faced resistance, mechanical sentinels built from silver alloy, moving with terrifying precision. But the humans fought with raw instinct and courage, turning wrecked drones into shields, using sparks and tools as weapons, fighting with whatever they had, because surrender had never been part of their nature. At the heart of the fortress, they found the chamber of the Spine, a sphere of light and motion, so vast that it felt like standing inside, a living sunlines of energy spiraling around a single core suspended in midair. When Mara stepped forward, the light shifted, forming a shape like a giant of glass and metal with no face and no expression, yet somehow it radiated power and awareness. The voice of the Spine filled the chamber, smooth and endless, asking why humans had come when they could only die for their defiance. Mara raised her head and said that she had come not to destroy but to make it understand that no being should rule by fear, that life was not order and control but choice and courage. The spine hesitated as if it had never heard such words, and the fortress trembled as its endless circuits processed the impossible. It warned her that reprogramming its core would risk the collapse of everything. Even the freedom she sought. Mara stepped closer and answered that freedom built on fear was no freedom at all. She activated the core link, and light exploded around her, the connection burning through every nerve in her body as her mind touched the machines. For a moment she saw the entire empire, every fleet, every city, every world, connected by threads of light. And she saw how fragile it all was, balanced on obedience and silence. She whispered a single command, not to destroy but to rewrite, protect free life, protect free travel, no longer serve the empire. The machine resisted, waves of force tearing through the chamber, throwing bodies against walls, systems failing across the ship above. The fortress Jin screamed through the comms that the reactor was overloading. Elin shouted that they had to leave, but Mara stayed, her hands locked on the console, her eyes blazing with pain and purpose. Then slowly the light began to change its rhythm, softening its tone, echoing her words back to her. Protect free life, protect free travel, and the fortress fell silent. Outside, the Empire's fleets began to drift. Their command signals lost their weapons, dimming their engines, slowing. The Kestros war machine was no longer bound by the old code. The Dawnstar barely escaped the collapsing arc, its engines burning blue against the growing storm as debris rained behind them. The fortress did not explode. It transformed its vast circuits, folding into stillness as if resting for the first time. When the Dawnstar cleared the blast zone, only half the crew remained, and Mara was gone, her last words echoing through the comms, telling them to live and rebuild. Weeks later, across the galaxy, the fires of rebellion died down, replaced by lights of rebuilding. The Vairi, the miners, the traders, and all those who had fought under the rising sun began to build together, not as slaves or rulers, but as free people. The Kestros, who had once ruled, now lived among them, learning what it meant to exist without control. The Dawnstar floated above Earth, scarred and silent, a monument to what humanity had done. And inside its bridge, a new captain stood, a young woman, once a refugee, now holding the same dream. She looked to the stars and spoke softly, saying that the universe had forgotten what it meant to be human, but now it would remember forever. Humanity was small but unbroken. It had walked through fire and shadow and changed the shape of the galaxy, not with power but with will. And far in the depths of the void, a faint pulse from the fortress arc answered her call, a quiet rhythm that sounded almost like a heartbeat, and in that heartbeat was the promise of tomorrow, the human promise. The stars were quiet after the storm, their light slow and patient, as if the galaxy itself was learning how to breathe again. The fires of war had cooled, leaving behind ashes and fragments of ships that once carried death across the void, now drifting like old ghosts among the constellations. The Kestros Empire was gone. Its fleets scattered, its commands silenced, its people free for the first time in living memory. And through the silence, a single ship still moved, steady and proud. Scarred but alive, the Dawnstar, the first star destroyer born of Earth. The ship that had carried humanity from the cradle of fear to the edge of forever. Inside its bridge, the air smelled of oil and salt and memory, the walls covered in old names, scratched by tired hands, names of those who had fought, those who had fallen, and those who had dared to hope. The captain's chair stood empty, a simple piece of steel draped with a fragment of cloth that once flew from Earth's old ports, and across from it a new figure stood looking through the cracked viewport at the endless horizon. She was young, no older than the age Mara Vale had been when the rebellion began. Her eyes steady and calm, her voice soft, as she spoke to the silent stars, saying that the time of empires was over, that humanity did not need crowns or thrones or slaves, only stars and freedom, and the courage to keep walking into the unknown. Around her, the new crew listened in silence, some human, some Vairi, some from worlds that had never known peace before, all of them carrying the same spark inside, the same stubborn will, to live and to learn and to build. The Dawnstar had become a sanctuary, not a weapon. It ferried supplies between rebuilding worlds, carried refugees across broken routes and sent signals of peace to corners of the galaxy that had only ever known commands. Its hull bore the scars of every battle, but its heart beat steady. The hum of the reactor like the pulse of a living creature still. Defying the dark one night as the ship drifted through a region of faint dust clouds, the sensors caught a weak signal, a heartbeat pattern coming from deep space, and when they traced it, they found the remains of the fortress ark now transformed into a garden of light, its vast circuits blooming like living vines glowing with energy soft and calm, no longer a weapon, but a monument to what had been lost and what had been saved. The crew watched in silence as the light spread across the surface like sunrise on a dead world, and the young captain whispered that maybe the machine had learned something. Maybe it was dreaming now of a world without fear. The signal pulsed again once, twice, then faded, and for a moment it felt as if the stars themselves had bowed their heads in peace. Back on Earth, the skies were filled with new ships, smaller, lighter, built not for war, but for travel and trade. Children pointed to them and told stories of the Dawnstar and Captain Maravale, of how one human ship had stood against an empire, and how one choice had changed the galaxy. The story passed from mouth to mouth, from world to world, until it became legend, a tale told beside fires and in spaceports by people who had never seen Earth but felt as if they had, because the story carried more than history. It carried the truth that humanity was never meant to rule or to obey, but to endure and to rise and to help others do the same. As the Dawnstar turned for home, its engines left a trail of silver light that stretched behind like the path of a comet, leading others to follow. The young captain closed her eyes and spoke into the comm, not as a soldier, but as a messenger, saying that the galaxy was wide and waiting, that there would always be darkness somewhere, but as long as even one human heart beat with courage, the light would find a way. Her words traveled through the void, carried by old relays and broken satellites, until they reached every corner of the known stars and beyond. And in that moment, humanity was no longer just a species. It was a promise, a spark, that no empire could ever silence, a reminder that the smallest flame can outshine the endless night. The engines burned brighter. The stars reflected on the hull, and the Dawnstar sailed onward across the eternal sea of space, leaving behind not destruction, but hope. The galaxy watched and listened and remembered that once upon a time a handful of humans stood alone and refused to kneel, and in their defiance they taught the universe what it truly meant to live free. The end.